Human beings are exceptionally good at finding patterns. We are wired to look at a sequence of events and immediately try to identify the invisible thread connecting them. But this instinct betrays us when we apply it to situations governed entirely by chance. This cognitive error is known as the gambler's fallacy, the error of arguing that the probability of a chance event is altered by a specific run of past events. At its core, this fallacy rests on the assumption that past outcomes somehow reach forward in time and physically dictate future results. The physical reality is quite different. Past random events exert zero physical or logical influence on future random events. This visualization shows a macro sequence where a bucket gradually fills with an equal distribution of red and blue balls. The error stems from a specific mathematical misunderstanding. People conflate the statistical probability of a long sequence of events over time with a predictive claim about one isolated event. A single upcoming event operates completely outside that established macro sequence. Believing in statistical streaks is a misunderstanding of how probability mechanics work in isolation. We can evaluate this error using the tools of logic and formal reasoning. In formal debate, any claim must be validated against a foundational rule known as the sufficiency criterion. For an argument to be valid, the premises provided must carry enough evidentiary weight to establish the conclusion. Think of an argument as a bridge. Valid evidence forms the solid structural link between your premise and your conclusion. The gambler's fallacy directly violates this structural requirement. Because independent events lack a causal link, pointing to a past streak as your premise provides exactly zero evidentiary weight. You cannot build a bridge to a future prediction without causality holding it up. The gambler's fallacy fails to meet the basic burden of proof. It creates an argument that is structurally void. The most practical environment to observe this logical error is the casino floor, where sequences of identical outcomes happen constantly. Imagine a game generating a timeline of 10 consecutive red outcomes. The hot player argues this streak proves they cannot lose the next round. The do player views the exact same outcomes and argues a win is statistically mandated to balance the universe. We can evaluate both of these arguments simultaneously against the sufficiency criterion. The physical reality invalidates both claims. Gambling devices possess no memory. Every single round is a closed, independent system. The 11th roll cannot see the past 10 rolls. Attaching causal weight to an inanimate object's past performance leads to a logically invalid conclusion. It does not matter whether the arguer thinks they are hot or do. This cognitive error frequently infects biological assumptions well beyond the casino. Consider parents who already have 3 sons, assuming their 4th child has higher odds of being a daughter. But a child's biological sex is completely unlinked to previous pregnancies. The odds reset entirely to a baseline probability. Previous outcomes carry no momentum. This distortion also applies to our expectations of social sequences. Someone using a dating service might assume their 8th blind date will be successful simply because the preceding 7 were terrible. The underlying premise relies on a strange assumption that an overarching causal force exists to balance the universe's dating pool. But the 8th date is an entirely independent human variable with zero causal connection to the first 7. Our intuition constantly searches for universal fairness. Because of this, we are highly prone to assigning false causal links to isolated everyday events. We can move from simply observing the fallacy to actively deconstructing it in a live discussion. The primary refutation strategy is to explicitly force your opponent to identify the mechanism of causality in their argument. Take the ultimate test case. A coin lands on heads 9 times in a row. The arguer claims the 10th flip must be tails to correct the statistical trend. This chart shows the statistical expectation over a large sample size of 30 flips. Probability dictates the results will eventually balance to about 15 heads and 15 tails. However, the coin itself possesses no physical memory drive. It cannot consult this statistical chart. Without a tangible physical mechanism to actively correct that statistical trend, the odds of the next flip remain exactly 1 in 2. Forcing an opponent to explain exactly how past independent events physically alter present reality exposes the emptiness of their premise. This gets to the core of the sufficiency criterion. Evidence that can arbitrarily support opposing viewpoints lacks the weight to prove either of them. When you show that an argument relies on evidence that could justify completely opposite conclusions, the premise is revealed to be structurally void. Now, we can move from simply observing the gambler's fallacy from afar to actively deconstructing it in a live, real-world discussion. The primary refutation strategy is to explicitly force your opponent to identify the mechanism of causality in their argument. Take the ultimate test case. A coin lands on heads 9 times in a row. The arguer claims the 10th flip must be tails to correct the statistical trend. This chart shows the statistical expectation over 30 flips. Probability tells us the results will eventually balance out to about 15 heads and 15 tails. However, the coin itself possesses no physical memory. It cannot consult this overarching statistical chart. Without a tangible physical mechanism to actively correct that statistical trend, the odds of the next flip remain exactly 1 in 2. Forcing an opponent to explain exactly how past independent events physically alter present reality exposes the emptiness of their premise. The secondary refutation strategy focuses on the sheer arbitrariness of the arguer's chosen conclusion. We can return to the poker table scenario from the textbook to demonstrate the flaw in this type of reasoning. Consider a player on a losing streak. They look at past data and conclude, "My time is coming. I'm bound to win soon." But that same player could look at the identical sequence of poor hands and conclude, "This just isn't my night." A single, identical data source is generating 2 wildly divergent and contradictory predictions, and the player can assert both with equal confidence. This gets to the core of the sufficiency criterion. Evidence that can arbitrarily support opposing viewpoints lacks the weight to prove either of them. When you show that an argument relies on evidence that could justify completely opposite conclusions, the premise is revealed to be structurally void.